This Week with Bob Mueller on News 2.
This week,
and when we discriminate, they say everything else is great, but we can't get people to move to the state to work for our company.
Tennessee businesses threaten to leave the state if anti-LGBTQ laws are enacted.
To create this sort of climate of hatred is the opposite of what the business community is looking for.
Tennessee Democrats claim Republican-led anti-LGBTQ legislation will cost the state millions in business investments. More in our This Week cover story.
We have legislation before our General Assembly right now that is, I believe, life-changing for our state.
Governor Lee chairs what he calls a conservative approach to criminal justice reform with panelists including Newt Gingrich and Rick Perry.
It's big, yes. It's bold, yes. And we can get it done.
President Biden moves forward with a multi-trillion-dollar infrastructure package despite strong Republican objection. Hello again and welcome to another edition of This Week. Bridgestone, Nissan, Amazon all signed an open letter opposing anti-LGBTQ legislation. More in our This Week cover story. But first, the other political headlines of the week. The battle lines over President Biden's infrastructure package have been drawn. Republicans argue the American Jobs Plan hardly addresses the country's needs. But the Biden administration says it's all part of its Build Back Better promise. Jesse Tenor reports from Washington.
The Biden administration is also selling the plan as a blueprint for sweeping social and economic change. For the Biden administration, infrastructure is more than just improved roads, bridges, and pipes.
This is a public health issue.
During a tour of a water treatment plant in California, Vice President Kamala Harris stressed how the president's multi-trillion-dollar infrastructure package would address racial equality.
To make sure all people have access to clean water and affordable water.
President Biden's plan would also make large investments in job training and affordable housing, along with improving pay and benefits for caregivers. Corporations would foot the bill.
We can compete with the rest of the world.
But Republicans argue a corporate tax increase would make the U.S. less competitive.
The last thing the economy needs right now is a big whopping tax increase on all the productive sections.
Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell and Missouri Senator Roy Blunt say only about 30% of the proposal fits their definition of infrastructure.
I think it's a mistake, and I also think it would be an easy victory if we go back and look at roads and bridges and ports and airports.
White House Press Secretary Jen Psaki says the president understands how to negotiate with Congress.
He knows some members think it's too big, some think it's too small. Frankly, there have been folks who have come out on both sides.
But President Biden has made it clear he ultimately wants the plan passed by the August recess, with or without Republicans. In Washington, I'm Jesse Tenor.
While numbers in Tennessee have been steady, 19 states are seeing a big jump in COVID-19 cases because of variants infecting younger people who haven't been vaccinated. And ABC's Ike Ejiochi reports more states are in a race to reopen.
President Biden marking a major milestone promise in the battle against the coronavirus pandemic, announcing that 150 million COVID-19 vaccine shots have been administered within his first 75 days in office. White House officials also announced all American adults will be available to get a COVID vaccine on April 19th, 2 weeks before the original deadline.
You're doing the right thing. It's really important. And when you go back, when you go home, get all your friends, tell them, get a shot when they can. We're going to be able to do this. Everyone's going to be able to before the month is out.
This as COVID numbers are beginning to surge, according to Health and Human Services. Deaths are now rising in at least 18 states. Hospitalizations are up over 10% in 16 states. The upper Midwest had a 23% jump in the past week alone. However, some states are moving forward and easing restrictions. California Governor Gavin Newsom announcing Tuesday plans to fully reopen the state's economy by June 15th. No more capacity limits for restaurants and businesses. Mask mandates, however, will remain.
It is incumbent upon all of us not to announce mission accomplished, not to put down our guard, but to continue that vigilance that got us where we are today.
And following scenes like this in Miami during spring break last month. The chaos forcing city leaders to impose a strict 8 p.m. curfew. For weeks, operating hours at Miami Beach were drastically shortened, a move Mayor Dan Gelber says is working for now, but Memorial Day is looming.
I am a little worried that at the end of this, people, especially young people, are going to come out in large numbers.
Gelber plans on ending the current curfew by April 12th. That could change depending on the COVID numbers. Ike Ajachi, ABC News, Washington.
Now to our This Week cover story. Big companies like Amazon, Nissan, and Warner Music Group came out against anti-LGBTQ legislation before state lawmakers. More than 120 small businesses and 30 corporations signed an open letter to the governor. State Capitol Newsroom reporter Gerald Harris has reaction from both sides.
Tennessee's a wonderful state to do business in, but businesses don't like discrimination.
Several bills are being debated on Capitol Hill that are drawing concerns from pro-LGBT groups, including Nashville's LGBT Chamber CEO, who says Tennessee's economy as a whole could suffer.
And when we discriminate, they say everything else is great, but we can't get people to move to the state to work for our company. We can't get people to stay in the state with this discriminatory legislation.
According to the chamber, at least 3 conventions are preparing to pull out, with more businesses preparing to pull the plug on investing in the state.
I think a lot of legislators are looking to call our bluff, so to speak. They don't think there's going to be any fallout to this discriminatory legislation. I am pleading with them, warning them that there is.
Republican legislators are leading the charge on anti-LGBT legislation, from bathroom policy changes, anti-trans youth health care bills, to restrictions on LGBT education. Both Democrats and Republicans agree that Tennessee is the place to do business.
In Tennessee, we've had a really successful business community, successful business climate.
But over 100 Tennessee businesses, large and small, even the Tennessee Chamber of Commerce and Industry Lee spoke in front of, have come out against discriminatory legislation, including anti-LGBT bills.
People are going to start making different decisions. Most people that bring jobs here can take those jobs to other states. There are other states competing for every single job we get, and to create this sort of climate of hatred is the opposite of what the business community is looking for.
While Governor Bill Lee says businesses have a right to speak out,
it's important that business voices their concerns or their desires. Business plays an incredibly important role in this community.
He says it's up to the General Assembly to make laws, not businesses.
At the end of the day, the people, through their elected representatives, make the law in this state.
However, Governor Lee would not take a position on whether Republican-led anti-LGBT legislation, from bathroom policy changes, anti-trans youth health care bills, to restrictions on LGBT education, is in fact discriminatory.
We'll comment on bills that make it through committee, and what we're working on are the bills that are right before us today.
Lee says the transgender athletic ban addressed discrimination against women. Reporting in Nashville, Gerald Harris, News 2.
Stay with us. This Week continues in a moment. Welcome back. Governor Lee spoke to the Nashville Chamber this week and answered questions about vaccine passports, mandatory vaccinations, and objection to President Biden's infrastructure plan.
I think it's important that, I don't know which specific bills you're talking about, but it's important that business voices their concerns or their desires. Business plays an incredibly important role in this community, and we have a great partnership with the businesses across the state. At the end of the day, the people, through their elected representatives, make the law in this state, and that's how the process works. I actually think some of what we see in business is political theater. We've seen that in Atlanta, certainly, and in Georgia. But at the end of the day, Tennesseans, through their legislators, who they elect, decide what the law is. And that's what I believe is the right process. Well, the only piece of legislation that I've addressed is the piece of legislation that discriminates against women in athletics. And I was very clear about what I believed in that. I think we should protect women's athletics and their ability to compete. And that's the only piece of legislation I've signed. The other pieces of legislation are not, they haven't moved the committee, so they're not something we've looked at yet. I'll look at every piece of legislation that comes to my desk.
You've seen these bills. You know
So we'll comment on bills that make it through committee, and what we're working on are the bills that are right before us today, because that's what we need to be working on. The bills that we have to make a decision about signing, as they come to our desk, we do that. Yeah, so I think vaccine passports are a bad idea. I do not believe that government should impose vaccine requirements or mandates in any way, and I'm working with the legislature to support legislation that backs that up. I also think government, well, I certainly hope that businesses follow that same pattern. I don't think it's in the best interest of our state for businesses to impose restrictions and mandates for vaccine. But I also don't think government should impose itself in the private affairs of business practices. So we're encouraging businesses in that way, but we're not going to restrict them. I think that private institutions have decisions they make on their own, but I think government agencies should not have vaccine requirements.
So you would be against UT requiring that, for example?
That's right.
Okay.
Certainly, we want as many Tennesseans to get the vaccine as we can. We're working really hard in all populations, including the prison population, to give information, to educate, to give folks the option. We have given choices about vaccines to our prison population. So we want Tennesseans of all population to take the vaccine. Well, I think sentencing is important. I think that criminal justice reform will not be a one-shot deal. This will be work that will continue into next year and the next year and the next year. It's something very important to me. And sentencing reform is something that we ought to look at. We haven't focused on it this year, but I'm working with leaders in the legislature to talk about how we do that going forward. Let's talk about those options. We can either take that money and be good stewards of it, or we can give that money to other states, because that's what would happen to it. The choice is not to give it back to the federal government. It's to give it to California or New York or Michigan or states that have been poorly fiscally managed, and therefore we will take the money that comes to our state and we will use it responsibly.
Stay with us. This week continues in a moment. Governor Lee calls it Second Chance Month, and this week he chaired a Zoom meeting with conservative criminal justice reform advocates.
It's a very important season in Tennessee, particularly as we talk about this issue of criminal justice reform, and that we have legislation before our General Assembly right now that is, I believe, life-changing for our state. 20 years ago, I got involved in the subject of criminal justice reform because I got involved in a prison ministry and called Men of Valor that many of you have heard me talk about. Worked with reentry, with mentoring men coming out of prison, employed, formerly incarcerated individuals. I really saw firsthand, beginning 20 years ago, the tension and the push and pull between retribution and rehabilitation. I also saw what I thought was a system that wasn't really working for anybody. It wasn't working well for the victims. It wasn't working well for those that were incarcerated. And the recidivism rate was something that we clearly could improve on. And it started me thinking about this 20 years ago.
I got involved in this in part because Chuck Colson, who had been in the Nixon White House and ended up going to jail after Watergate, really, I think, had a profound religious conversion experience and helped develop an entire approach to faith-based prisons. And in Texas in particular, they took to heart what Paul Colson was doing, which was trying to genuinely change the heart of the prisoner. And they had remarkable breakthroughs in having far fewer people go back to prison a second time. So the recidivism rate, as it's called, dropped very dramatically, specifically in the prisons that had adopted this faith-based approach. And I was one of those, like, I was very tough on crime. In fact, I would say I helped make a major mistake in the 90s because we inappropriately used much tougher standards for crack cocaine than for regular cocaine, and had a devastating effect on the black community in ways that I look back on as one of the great policy mistakes that I participated in my career. This is an effort to say something very different. One, there are violent people who should be kept away from the rest of society, and but it's a very small number compared to the total prison population. Two, it's both inhumane and dumb to have somebody under your control fail to teach them, fail to prepare them, put them back on the street where the only thing they learn is how to be a smarter criminal, and then be shocked that they show back up in prison. It makes for a society which is unsafe and a society which is both wasting lives and wasting money. The fact is that over 90% of the people who are in prison will get out. The question is, will they get out better prepared to be in society, better prepared to be reintegrated, better prepared to earn a living, better prepared to take care of their family, or will they get out having been brutalized and isolated and having no capacity to earn a living and having no capacity to take care of their family? And I think true conservatism has to take the position that we're in fact going to help people. We want to plan from the day you enter prison how you're going to leave prison. Now, again, I'm distinguishing if you're a hardcore, if you're a rapist, if you're an armed robber, if you're a murderer, then protecting society from you is a very different question. And those people ought to be in separate facilities where they can't infect the people who've had modest crimes but now are put into, in effect, a university for crime. And so I would separate out the violent people, and I'd be very tough about violent people.
And in the late 80s and the early 90s, Texas got really hard on crime. We had a speaker, lieutenant governor, and 90 through 94, Ann Richards was our governor. And we decided we were going to get really tough on crime and send a message to the public out there that we're tough. And we did. We built a lot of prisons, spent billions of dollars. And as Pat Nolan's done a very good job of, we put a lot of kids in prison that we were mad at, but that we weren't afraid of. And what they did is once they got to prison, they learned how to be professional criminals. And so what we were doing, rather than educating them and helping them change their lives, we did change their lives, but in a really negative way. And we started creating a graduate school for criminals, if you will, in these prisons. In the early 2000s, I had a conversation with a district judge, a Democrat district judge by the name of Crusoe from Dallas. And he asked me to really consider the concept of drug courts, of shock probation, of boot camps, to try to get these kids, grab their attention, put them back on a track, rather than sending them to prisons. You can call me a lot of things, which I have been called a lot of things in my political life, but soft on crime is not one of them. And we've been, in Texas, we believe in dispensing justice. But there's nothing just when the system is broken in the sense of you're either putting people in prison that don't deserve to be there, but we also need to clearly stand up when mistakes have been made and fix those. And that's what this legislation does. And my hat's really off to you from the standpoint of your Republican members, and for that matter, your Democrat members of the Tennessee legislature can go home to their constituents and say, we were really smart on crime. We saved X numbers of hundreds of millions or potentially even billions of dollars.
This is hard work. The easiest thing to do is treat everyone the same and make a bunch of rules and shut the doors and walk away. The hard work is to recognize that every distinct human being is different. And if we work hard, we can determine who needs to be there, who doesn't need to be there, who will have better outcomes with an alternative sentence, who will be successful when they reenter with a different, a different package of services around them with a different approach to the way they reenter. This is hard work, and but it's worth it because it is life-changing work.
Stay with us. This week continues in a moment. Thank you for spending part of your weekend with us. That will do it for another edition of This Week. We hope to see you back here next weekend for another edition of This Week, and you have a great week.